Welcome back, everybody, to the criminal law. In this lesson, we are moving away from the definition of theft as part of our property offences or dishonesty offences, depending on how you want to construe it, and instead are talking about fraud. Now, this lesson isn't actually going to include that much by way of definitions or information necessarily. We're just going to take an introduction to fraud. Fraud is probably the easiest offence of all to understand. It's the most simple. It's the one with the least amount of case law, arguably, given it's the one that probably takes up the least amount of pages in an ordinary textbook, at least in my opinion anyway, because really it just builds on some of the things that we've studied in theft. So you will notice the connection and the similarities between theft and fraud quite quickly, hopefully at least, quite quickly, and as a result of which we can come to basic conclusions about what fraud is relatively quickly and relatively easily. This is the second main property offence that we're covering in this series. Obviously, we're talking about the subject of fraud. And like I said again, it doesn't require too many lessons. We'll just spend a little bit of time on this. We're only going to spend a little bit of time in this video at least. It's a relatively easy subject to understand once we have studied it. Doesn't require too many lessons at all. So, as an introduction to fraud, fraud is something that, until the passage of new legislation, in fact, was actually encompassing of a number of different criminal offences. So the new legislation that we'll get to in a second sort of codifies and mushes together what fraud was into this new offence. But at least prior to that, we have sort of all-encompassing different offences that had various different ideas and names. Fraud itself became the crime that we know it today as a result of the 2006 Fraud Act. Not to suggest that there wasn't fraud before 2006, it is just that the Fraud Act codified a lot of these offences and really brings them together into one piece of legislation. So, as a basic understanding, Section 1 of the Fraud Act outlines the different types of fraud that exist. Now, the different types of fraud that exist is a little bit of a misleading way of putting it, because fraud itself is fundamentally one kind of crime that has with it a number of very similar characteristics, but it can be done in a number of different ways, if that makes sense. It is still basically the same crime, but it is the different circumstances in which it is performed that gives it the certain different types of fraud. And this is what Section 1 outlines. So Section 1 says that a person is guilty of fraud if he is in breach of any of the sections listed in subsection 2. If we then go on and move to look at subsection 2, it says that the sections are section 2, which is fraud by false representation, section 3, which is fraud by failing to disclose information, and Section 4, which is fraud by abuse of position. So essentially, these are all the same offence in the sense that they're all fraud, but they are fraud in different circumstances, and you come about the fraud itself as a result of different acts themselves, if that makes sense. So they all fall into the category of fraud. They all lead to the same end result of being guilty and convicted of fraud. But the way you get there depends on the circumstances of the facts of a particular case. You may have committed fraud by false representation, or maybe you've committed fraud by abusing your position or failing to disclose information, all of which constitute fraud for the purposes of this act. A person who is guilty of fraud is liable on summary conviction to imprisonment for a term not exceeding the general limit in a magistrate's court, or to a fine not exceeding the statutory maximum, or both. But they could also be convicted on indictment, which is obviously something that is a little bit more serious, and on conviction on indictment to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 10 years, or to a fine, or to both. Before we finish then, let me just quickly touch on the nature of fraud, the idea of fraud, and the kinds of ways in which fraud exists. Even though it is seen as new legislation, at least, or in the new legislation, fraud is seen as something of a conduct crime rather than a result crime. This obviously makes sense. It means that essentially causation is not necessary to show an instance of fraud. And we will see this when we start looking through the different pieces of the legislation, that causation isn't necessarily there. Causation, because of course there is not necessarily an end result that needs to be achieved in order for somebody to have committed fraud. And so we shift away from the idea of it being a result crime to the idea of it being a conduct crime. So that's basically an introduction to fraud. The next lesson will go into more detail looking at the first of these types of fraud, which is of course fraud by false representation, as codified in Section 2 of the 2006 Fraud Act.